All right, this is a reenactment of a conversation between me and Kento, talking about the elbow joint and what happens there. So, one of the things that we figured out was that the radial humeral joint is made for compression, or the compressive support of elbow functions. Right, because the conversation began when Kento wanted to talk about what happens when people are stuck in elbow hyperextension and they get a lot of valgus collapse and inability to supinate their hands from that. And we started talking about what potentially happens and ligamentous muscle support and things like that. So before we go into the muscular kinetics and kinematics of this, I want to talk about the architectural features of the ulnar radial complex, right? It's kind of amazing that the human body can have a pseudo structure because the radial ulnar joint is not a structure but a complex or a region, whatever you want to call it, but a pseudo structure that can serve two opposing features equally as well, right? So what I mean by that is, we look at this, how this is put together. It's very obvious that this joint is made for compression, but it doesn't flex very well. Can you see how it would require significant muscular or otherwise structural support for this to stay on the capitulum, right? Nothing, there's no conformity between the two. This thing is just very good at jamming into the capitulum at whatever the fuck angle. However, the ulnar, however, is the opposite of the two. Right? It's very good at conforming to the capitulum in whatever a joint angle it may find itself, or the organism may happen to need, right? At any joint angle, but it's not very good at compressing itself into the capitulum, at least compared to this guy, right? It's not nearly as linear, right? And there's this going on, right? And through its attachments past the back of the capitulum into the olecranon process, there will be limitations as to how much compression you can get into this. And that's not even talking about the attachment of anconians and triceps and things like that. In other words, this is meant for mobility so that you can be as adaptable as possible in various joint angle configurations at the elbow joint. And this is meant for maximal compressive stability, right? Damn it. Okay, cool. So let's look at this guy then. If you've been hanging out with us for a little bit, you are gonna know that when we teach protraction or reaching, we like to do it with a wrist that is radial deviated, right? In other words, this guy and this guy are going to turn on and take the thumb side of the wrist and move it towards the elbow, right? Radial deviation. And for the longest time, we simply thought that, or at least I simply thought that when this happens, it will pull, because the attachments are on the humerus. Obviously, it will pull the bottom of the humerus forward, and when that happens, it'll lengthen or create the kinetics of attempting to lengthen the triceps and load the triceps, and then the triceps will pull the bottom of the glenoid forward, complementing what pec minor will be doing and throwing. Pec minor will throw the whole thing into a anterior tilt or anterior rotation, giving us that hunched over reaching thing that a lot of people see. and the inclusion of a tricep would alleviate that issue. So for the longest time, we were just thinking that the radial deviators would be the thing to do that, and because of essentially the tonic stretch reflex. Now this conversation, now that we're looking at the architecture of the elbow joint much more closely, we realize that yes, indeed, this whole thing, this whole kinetic circuit, it begins at the leading joint of the scapula, like thoracoscapular joint. It begins there, goes on to the shoulder joint, glenohumeral joint, and then elbow, and then wrist. Right. So you start with protraction, flexion, and cold contraction of triceps and biceps. We'll talk about them more. Blah 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 blah. Eventually get to the wrist. Right. And we realize that through radial deviation, you can actually complete the circuit by creating kinetics here and send it all the way the fuck back to the scapula. How? Radial deviation. So you radial deviate, and these guys do blah 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 blah, and they shorten this, right? They shorten the thumb side of all these tendons. In other words, they're going to lengthen the ulnar side of these tendons. In the process, they will be eccentrically loading this, right? Flexor carpi ulnaris, right? And because it's one of the ulnar deviators, so then it will obviously be essentially loading by the radial deviation. Well, when that happens, it will also load this bicipital aponeurosis. When that happens, it's going to pull on the biceps, right? Of course, it's going to pull on the biceps, and when you pull on the biceps, or you pull on anything like this, tonic stretch reflex, then this thing's going to contract, and this tendon right here is going to probably do a very good job of shoving this radius into the lateral capitulum, right? And it's going to provide then the opposite side of this whole thing with respect to radial deviation, right? Because radial deviation is going to excuse me, shove the radius into the capitulum from the lateral side or from the radial side. Now, from the ulnar side of the radius through this long head, short head, whatever, who cares? This head of the fucking biceps will complete and give you a much more linear compression of the radial humeral joint. Now, when that happens, this contraction will obviously kick up triceps as well, right? You kick up triceps. Now, at the same time, because of this thing's connection to the olecranon, there's no fucking way that the fascia around here at the bursa doesn't have some kind of a kinetic effect on the triceps, right? Then it makes sense that a lot of times when we have people reach who have never reached before, who have never performed a systemic or integrated protraction, they feel it in the triceps very, very intensely. I want to say it's because of this, right? You tuck on this, then you're pulling on this. You pull on this, tonic stretch reflex is going to turn on your triceps, right? And then when this happens, this whole complex here between your radial deviators and your ulnar deviators through this, and then through the bicipital aponeurosis, you're then passing on the kinetic influences of what's going on at the wrist and at the forearm into what's going on at the actual upper arm. Then you're creating a co-contraction between the biceps and the triceps, allowing them to act almost as a fake serratus, right? Because serratus, you look at its architecture, it has a very linear pull on the scapula in protraction. So when that happens, you need other things to complement this, because in the sagittal plane, right, meaning whether or not the scapula is going to tilt forward or is it going to tilt backwards? Is it going to tilt over or is it going to tilt under, right? In the sagittal plane of motion, the influence of the serratus is more or less neutral, meaning it's not going to tilt the scapula into anterior rotation or posterior rotation. However, if you don't manage things well at the shoulder joint, meaning glenohumeral joint, that will change, right? Because you got pec minor, that's going to pull you into the hunched over situation, or you're going to have bicep tendons acting on their own without integration from the wrist or the triceps giving you the same thing, right? Because after all, when you reach, you do need the biceps to get you up there for shoulder joint flexion. So if you don't have some sort of reciprocation at the wrist, you're brewing trouble in your short-term future. So when we have this, now we have co-contraction and a much more linear kinetic presentation owing to co-contraction of biceps, triceps, at the upper arm, and at the lower arm / elbow joint, you have the co-contraction of radial deviators and ulnar deviators, as well as this bicipital aponeurosis that completes this much more even divide of kinetic influences. All right, hope that was helpful.